Since its creation in 1947, the Doomsday Clock has represented the likelihood of a human-made global catastrophe, with midnight signaling the complete annihilation of humanity. It was initially set at 7 minutes to midnight in the wake of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. When the US and Soviet Union began testing the first hydrogen bombs, it shot up to 2 minutes. From 2020 to 2022, a period rife with conflict and exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, it remained at 100 seconds. And ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in January of 2023, we've remained at a mere 90 seconds to midnight. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which maintains the Doomsday Clock, says this is because humanity continues to face an unprecedented level of danger, and we should respond urgently, as if today were the most dangerous moment in modern history. The Bulletin's primary area of concern is nuclear risk. Normally, treaties and policies could protect us from this danger, but over time, their power has been greatly limited. Let's review some of the most notable ones. We begin our trip down memory lane in 1967, where the strategic arms limitations talks began between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. Out of these talks, we got the Treaty on the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which both prevents non-nuclear states from getting nukes, and also keeps nuclear states from helping them obtain them. We also got the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, to limit ballistic missile-delivered nukes to only basic defensive purposes. Then, the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty eliminated the US and Soviet Union's short and intermediate-range missiles. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, reduced strategic nuclear weapons and was replaced by the second New START in 2010. Whew, that was a lot, so let's put them on this timeline as a visual. And while we're at it, let's check back in on the status of those treaties. The NPT is still active, but South Sudan, India, Pakistan, and Israel have never signed it despite possessing nuclear weapons. And North Korea withdrew in 2003. The United States withdrew from the ABM in 2002, and the INF expired in 2019. START 2 was renewed for a 5-year extension in 2021, but given how relations are between the US and Russia, they're expected to let it die in 2026. There's also the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, which the US withdrew from in 2018, so in short, we don't have many limitations on existing nuclear states left. With the absence of policy preventing them from refilling their arsenals, the world has become a much more dangerous place. The situation is so threatening because there are so many tension points in the world right now where a nuclear bomb might be seen as a viable tool. First, as we know, North Korea withdrew from the NPT, greatly increased its nuclear arsenal, and conducted multiple intercontinental ballistic missile tests despite international condemnation. Nuclear states have stakes in ongoing global conflicts like Israel-Palestine, US-China hostility, and the most ominous being Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which the US has been heavily involved in, pitting the two greatest nuclear powers, who possess nearly 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal, against each other once again. Putin expressed earlier this year the reality that this conflict could escalate into nuclear war. We've backslid into a serious dilemma. With weapons of mass destruction far worse than we could have imagined, essentially no global agreement on the restriction, and a bunch of geopolitical powder kegs ready to explode? Why? Do we really think that nuclear weapons would solve our problems? That the world would be a better place? At least for the person who fired first? Let's look at the reality of what would actually happen if we dropped a nuclear bomb. Technology has come a long way since the Cold War, and weaponry is no exception. Nukes are more powerful, and we have a lot more of them. Say a country decided to use one of these, what would happen? Well, you're probably already familiar with the stages of a nuclear explosion. The initial fireball that decimates everything within its reach, the thermal pulse and shockwave that burn and destroy buildings kilometers away. But did you know about the fallout that can cause radioactive materials to circulate in the atmosphere for years? And the possible nuclear winter that could plunge temperatures by up to 10 degrees Celsius, devastating agriculture and ecosystems around the world? That can't possibly be to any country's advantage. And even if we could guarantee these broader effects didn't happen and harm was miraculously confined to only the targeted country without retaliation from it or its allies, a highly improbable situation, it would still be so impractical to detonate one of these weapons. Like I said, modern nukes have a greater magnitude and could practically destroy the target nation's economic capabilities and pull resources from its neighbors and allies towards recovery too. We live in a society that depends on the global market, where poverty and income inequality are serious crises in all but a few nations, even economic superpowers like the US. It's also likely that the targeted nation took part in the food distribution system, as most countries do, so being hit by a nuclear bomb would exacerbate food shortages around the world. But we'd adapt, some people say. In theory, yes, but in practice, no. Just look at conflicts like the war between Ukraine and Russia, which, despite its impact on both nations, has allowed them to retain most of their GDP and land. Yet still, interruptions in the supply chain created global inflation, and our food distribution system is so delicate that millions of vulnerable families were plunged into food insecurity. Just imagine what would happen if a nuclear bomb exploded. It could be so much worse. Then, the forced displacement. Unlike any other conflict where full evacuation often does not occur, a large impact zone surrounding a nuclear blast becomes completely uninhabitable. With literally nowhere else to go but out, it would be the worst refugee crisis in history. Governments are already unprepared to handle those fleeing from current conflicts, often treating them as a national security threat instead of creating policies to adapt to the situation. For example, in the US, states along the southern border impose inhumane technology and reject refugees altogether, sending them to overloaded sanctuary cities already at their limit. In the European Union, government inaction and the criminalization of private efforts to save migrants escaping by sea has resulted in hundreds drowning and dying in shipwrecks. In either case, those who make it still starve and sleep on the streets. So, you see, our institutions are wholly unequipped to handle the consequences of a nuclear explosion. Honestly, we may never be prepared to deal with a catastrophe of that magnitude. There is no winning, even if you're the one who fires first, because everyone loses. So, what can we do? We decided to focus on domestic policy solutions for the United States, since it is one of the foremost nuclear powers. So, let's start with a story close to home. 4 commercial nuclear reactors have produced power in Connecticut, and they sit along the Connecticut River and the Long Island Sound so the water can be used for cooling purposes. Obviously, radioactive nuclear waste is produced, so we put it in dry casks near the power reactors. There's no leakage, and everything is normal in the area. All good, right? No! But why? Well, these casks were constructed for temporary storage. But because the federal government has failed to find a location for long-term storage of fuel, radioactive waste has been sitting in these vulnerable sites for decades longer than expected. Like the 43 casks sitting on a pad along the Connecticut River, which flows into the Long Island Sound, which connects all of New England. Like, what a great idea to just plop our decaying nuclear waste right along a major waterway that millions of people depend on for transportation, food, and recreation. While there's no guarantee that something in the future, an attack, a natural disaster, a freak accident, might not cause thousands of gallons of waste to contaminate such a crucial body of water and cause unimaginable damage to people and ecosystems. Casks like those were meant to be stored in deep geological repositories where they can decay safely over time. This being the preferred method of nuclear waste disposal in most countries, including ours, by the way. We had a site selected by the federal government for this purpose, Yucca Mountain in Nevada, but numerous issues arose and so efforts were abandoned. So now, nuclear waste just sits in concrete barrels all across the nation, dangerously exposed and still radioactive. And this isn't even close to the worst situation. Let's look at Hanford, Washington, a site used to produce plutonium for the Manhattan Project. It's also located near a body of water, the Columbia River, for similar reasons as the plants in Connecticut. But, unlike in Connecticut, here 54 million gallons of nuclear sludge were found leaking into the Columbia River. Scientists wasted $4 billion planning a defective treatment plant that was abandoned in 2012. In 2017, the roof of a tunnel containing rail cars filled with radioactive waste collapsed. And to this day, 1/3 of the almost 180 containers there are known to be leaking into the soil and groundwater. The local authorities claim the radiation isn't dangerous, but rates of cancers and other disorders remain unusually high. This is not a unique story. 2 million pounds of mercury remain in the soils and waters of eastern Tennessee. Radioactive plumes are contaminating the Great Miami Aquifer near Cincinnati. More than 70 disposal sites across the country, 2/5 of which are near low-income and minority communities, are waiting for a permanent, safe location to transport their waste to, so that residents don't have to be poisoned by radiation exposure. We must invest in our citizens, into safely relocating nuclear waste and cleaning up the messes we made instead of allowing people to suffer. But of course, with any policy proposal, the first question anyone asks is, where will we get the money for it? In the next 30 years, the United States is projected to spend $1.7 trillion on maintaining and replacing nuclear weapons. $1.7 trillion to replenish and bolster an arsenal already boasting over 5,000 weapons, already the second largest in the world, in the presence of which only drives other nations to increase their stockpiles too, as to stand a chance against ours. Yeah, we don't need it. We think that rerouting money from this fund is a more feasible first step towards disarmament than destroying weapons outright, especially given the United States' position in global conflicts, withdrawal from treaties, and encouragement of nuclear proliferation in recent years. We've made it clear that officials and even much of the public want to keep the weapons to ward off potential threats. But we have a lot of weapons already, so maybe it would be okay to stop producing and divert that money towards cleanup and disposal. We could finally address dangerous pollution in sites like Hanford and explore alternative methods that would make finding a potential site for permanent disposal easier, like using directional borehole drilling instead of mines, or experimenting with shale formations as an alternative rock to store waste in because of its abundance throughout the United States. In any case, there's just so much we haven't experimented with, haven't paid for, so much government standstill that is hurting our most vulnerable populations. Turning our focus towards the real impacts nuclear waste has on our citizens, instead of preparing for a hypothetical attack we may not and pragmatically should not ever launch, is the first step. But it's not enough that a small group of people like us attending this selective conference understand this. We speak from a position of privilege, as a group of the educated elite, one that has relatively little power when it comes to influencing public opinion or the government's actions. The general public has lost touch with the anti-nuclear zeal that dominated back around the 80s. Today, nearly 2/3 of Americans say they don't know enough about nuclear weapons to assess the benefit or harm to them personally. But roughly the same amount also say they are interested in learning more. So let's teach them. We should focus on mobilizing the next generation. But how? The obvious answer seems to be focusing on social media, as it is the most prominent platform for information these days. But so much activism on social media is performative, all likes, comments, and well wishes to keep up appearances without any action. We call it slacktivism. So how do we create genuine investment in learning about nuclear weapons and policy? And how do we use that interest to create change? Well, it seems when you have ideas in the abstract, which are complex and not easy to connect with, we see unhelpful stuff, like the black squares on Blackout Tuesday and infographics that are reposted without much thought. But trends and celebrity influencers draw larger crowds and shape the behaviors of impassioned fans across the globe. I mean, you probably know more people who would drop tons of money on merch for their favorite music artist, but wouldn't donate a penny to an activism group, or could talk longer about the lore of a popular anime than on current nuclear policy. We're not too apathetic to change things, the passion is there. We just have to redirect it. We suggest a thorough and consistent media campaign, recruiting athletes, musicians, gamers and live streamers, actors, animation studios, you name it, to demonstrate their activism, spread information about the cause, and encourage their fans to do the same. This must be done over a prolonged period of time, as studies show that the one-and-done attitude only serves to discredit the influencer as inauthentic and is ineffective as a form of activism. We can pair this with a stronger focus on nuclear technology and policy in the educational system, so the information is reinforced by both institutions and the figures that shape our perception of what is right. It's far better than having only government messaging, as people seem to trust relatable influencers much more than they do government institutions. Remember COVID? Maybe one day, when the faces of our global leaders start looking a little less like this and slowly become replaced with young people who grew up on the precipice of conflict, lived through a global pandemic, have seen the consequences of inaction, and have been taught to do something about it, we'll be able to turn back the clock.